and we can move on to the next speaker, and also continue both of them together, I guess, afterwards as well, because it will be by Jonathan Sholl on a very similar topic, at least that it's also concerning aging. That is, our next speaker, Jonathan Sholl, is currently located at the ImmunoConCept lab in Bordeaux, that also Martin mentioned being a very interdisciplinary group. And his talk was going to be on mobilizing biogerontology and immunology in the project of theorizing health. Right, the floor is yours, 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Gregor, for the introduction. Hopefully, can you hear me all right? Didn't see the screen, it's working well? Perfect, all right. So, and thanks to everyone for attending, for joining and tuning in all around the world. It's nice that even if we can't manage to be in person, I guess we're still together in some general sense. And thanks as well to Martin for organizing the conference. So just to jump right in, since time is somewhat limited with regards to the talk, I want to begin this talk with looking at a kind of general observation. And this observation is that when we look around the sciences, we see that kind of the development of theories and theorization in general is something that's central to many of kind of the basic sciences. And we can see a variety here of just different examples of theories that we can find throughout the sciences. And when we look at the medical sciences, in more particular, we see, of course, that we made lots of progress in our understanding. We have a rather detailed amount of anatomical, physiological knowledge and a variety of local medical theories. But one that seems to be interestingly absent is any kind of unifying theory about what health or disease could be. And so the kind of question that I've been asking in a way in the last few years is to try to see how and whether we can construct a theory of health within the medical sciences. So this is kind of the general issue that I want to address today. Now, the outline for this will first be to kind of provide some brief and rather quick thoughts as to why we don't really have a theory of health in the sciences, what could be seen as to be at stake in developing such a theory, and in a way where we might look. And so, as Gregor mentions, kind of the two general sciences that I want to look to draw some insights are immunology and biogerontology. And I think these two sciences in particular, in one way that I've been thinking about it recently, that how they could help us is by helping to formulate specific questions, namely what it is that we ascribe health to, and in general then what it is to be healthy. And I think this can help to understand, in a sense, what's going on within the physiological sciences. So to begin with the first issue in terms of why we don't have a theory of health, there have been kind of different things that we can put together in here. And a couple of philosophers, in a sense, have suggested different historical or technical reasons for this. And the general idea is that if we look back into medical history, so this was also brought up yesterday, that we have certain ancient theories about what health or disease, in a sense, could be, and this sort of ancient theories being a kind of balance or imbalance. But through time and kind of driven by a lot of technological advances, we've started to focus more and more on a kind of localized etiological explanations. And we have now a variety of specific diseases, but little to really tie them together into some framework about disease as such. And Derasson, for example, has suggested that genetics could provide such a unifying framework, but it still needs to be carried out. And I think there's a similar sort of issue within physiology, in that we've been tracking a variety of issues and ways in which we can describe normal functions and normal variations, but not necessarily getting at health as such. Now, there is also some kind of social and practical reasons for this, in the sense that medical theories and models, while they're quite abundant, tend to be overshadowed precisely by the more practical concerns of medicine. So we have social concerns. There's a strong need to focus on treatments, on trials, precisely because people are sick, and needing to help them is certainly a key focus of what medicine is trying to do. And this is oftentimes overshadows then the sort of more abstract theorizing that can be done. Now, when trying to think about this sort of issue about developing a theory, of course, we could even ask a basic question of, would it even be useful to have one? And I imagine a lot of philosophers and perhaps even scientists could be quite pessimistic here, saying that health is just a vague or value-laden or not even a scientific concept. And some have even suggested that medical research, in fact, proceeds just fine without such a theory in terms of developing piecemeal and causal explanations. But what I want to kind of push back a little bit here is to suggest, well, this non-utility of such a theory, it really hasn't been shown. So I think we shouldn't necessarily assume it a priori. And I don't believe in a sense that it's really supported by the history of science. So I mentioned already that theorizing has been quite crucial in a variety of sciences, and certainly in physiology in particular. And I think we can argue along the lines of Thompson here that our medical models and theories are quite connected to the rest of science and share the same theoretical depth and sophistication and explanatory power of those sciences. So I think this certainly forces us to ask, well, why not explore this kind of consilience and theoretical potential that seems to be there? And this is then getting back to kind of what could be at stake in such a theory. I think there are two things. The first could be to see how, one challenge is to see whether and how we might unify the objects or the reference of the physiological sciences. So looking at whether we're talking about mechanisms or processes or specific properties, we're trying to see whether or not we can analyze these reference and try to unify them into some sort of framework. In this sense, we would be looking at health as a kind of experimental construct. And in doing so, the second problem or second question would be whether or not this kind of unifying process could lead to or produce a broader theoretical framework to provide and produce robust explanations and generalizations. So I think going back then to kind of the two basic questions I think that we can extract from the two sciences that I want to look at today. So looking at immunology, again, another way of formulating this is to see how immunology helps to delineate a unit of health, and how biogerontology, on the other hand, can help us to see how we might assess this unit through time. And I think putting these together can provide some insights as to this sort of general theorization of health. So, and in the rest of the talk, I'll kind of look at these in particular a little more detail. So first, in the issue of immunology, one of the central insights here is to think about the organism as a functional unit. And this touches on and gets into a lot of long-standing issues with regards to the debate about biological individuality within philosophy of biology, which I'm not going to get into, but at least just to suggest that there does seem to be one quite promising reply within immunology. And part of the suggestion here is that the further we've gotten into immunology, we start to see how we've gone beyond some sort of simplistic paradigms about self and non-self, and to think about immunity as solely defense. And now we see it as a much broader set of capacities, looking at defense and tolerance and regulation, and seeing it as a truly systemic regulatory process going on throughout the organism. But we also see it as something that's quite ubiquitous in nature, in the sense that even the very basic, kind of the core of an immune response in terms of identifying and thereby regulating or eliminating targets is something we find already in bacteria. And it's also more inclusive than we thought, in the sense that, of course, immunity entails now this symbiotic dialogue with and a kind of control over our resident microbiota. So this leads into the suggestion that we can think about or delineate an organism in terms of a biochemically regulated and functionally integrated multi-species unit. So we have some kind of a functional unit that we're referring to. And we can spell this out then a little bit further, looking at a couple theories, and to say, how does this unit kind of regulate itself? And one of these ways in which this has been put forth, the kind of mechanistic description in a way, is to see how the variety of different immune responses, these effector responses of the immune system, get triggered precisely by discontinuous changes or discontinuous rates of changes in molecular patterns. And so I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about some of these by Gregor himself, looking at how the immune system is getting into pattern and function recognition. But the suggestion is that this rates of change is something that's able to kind of unify, and there's a graphic here on the right, the different ways in which the immune system responds. Now, similarly, in kind of building off this, there's also this notion about immunity in terms of an equilibrium. And here we have this notion that we can think about homeostasis on this sort of superorganismal level in terms of a dynamic equilibrium of different inhibition and activation responses. So here, this kind of graphic put forth by Herbert has suggested that if we look at, for example, these kind of ways to categorize immune responses along these 4 different axes, we can see how kind of their interaction and their global regulation can lead to different kinds of immune responses. And the idea that insofar as there is kind of no single one that becomes inhibited to a great degree or excited to a great degree, there's a kind of general balance and regulation of them. This is something that helps to really define what a homeostatic regulation could be. So it's just 2 kind of general ways to spell out the functioning of this overall unit. So it at least puts forth a kind of suggestion towards this answer, at least very quickly, but that this immunological organism can be some kind of a unit of health here at least. And I think this gets at one sort of general insight or intuition that health is perhaps most appropriately applied to a whole organism. And this immunological approach at least helps to try to define what that holism is in terms of this systemic unit that's globally regulating homeostasis. But even if we have this sort of functionally integrated unit, as I mentioned, this kind of answers part of one of the questions that I was interested in, but the other one in terms of what it is to be healthy, here still remains to be answered. And for this, I think some insights, as I said, can be gained from looking at biogerontology. So, as we've already heard, there's kind of research is leading towards this notion about a variety of mechanisms or the so-called hallmarks of aging. And we see how heterogeneity within the overall aging process throughout the organism, leading to this notion that there's no single aging phenotype, but a kind of landscape of aging phenotypes. And in a recent article, Maya Lemon has put forth a way to kind of bring some of these different ideas about aging together and to say that aging can be understood as a balance of some promotive and protective mechanisms. In other words, mechanisms that either promote degradation in general or kind of protect against it. And just spelling these out a little bit, of course, we know that one of the central theories about aging is that these changing pressures of natural selection are what help to explain different limits to lifespan. That these kind of changes or the pressures of natural selection get weaker throughout the life course, particularly starting with adulthood. And this leads to less selection for post-reproductive survival and health. And this, coupled with the kind of accumulating damage and physiological or functional decline, helps to define what these sort of promotive mechanisms are. But throughout this, these hallmarks of aging, we also see different evolved physiological repair mechanisms that are also partly compensating or counteracting these different forms of degradation. And what Lemon has suggested is that the sort of shifting balance between these different mechanisms is what helps to explain the overall rate of aging in individuals. And what I would like to do is kind of building on this a little bit is just to look at and to ask, well, what could this balance then tell us about health? And I think there are 2 kind of ways in which we can get to this. And the first is that we can see how there are also some generally potentially unifying theories about aging. One of them has been put forth in terms of thinking about aging as a failure of so-called homeodynamics in the maintenance and repair systems. And here, homeodynamics refers to this buffering capacity of a biological system or an ability to survive and maintain a healthy state. And together with Suresh Ratan, a biogerontologist, we've tried to put forth this notion that we could think about healthy aging precisely in terms of the maintenance of homeodynamics and breaking this down into specific kinds of phenotypic parameters and mechanistic biomarkers to help measure the ways in which homeodynamics can be maintained through time. And there's other recent researchers have kind of built on this idea as well. And I think Peter Lennart is also attending this conference today. have been looking at how we could not only study homeodynamics, but we could say, well, when we're looking at this sort of the relationship or this nature, this buffering capacity, of course, we're studying it through time. And so what we're trying to look at here are phenotypic trajectories. So the aging research in this sense is leading to a kind of notion that we're not looking at a specific or single state of health and disease, but rather a continuum of dynamically evolving patterns. And we're doing this by tracking the accumulation then of internal and external changes that would shape an individual's phenotypic space. And this leads to this kind of graphic understanding of aging in terms of a general decreasing set of phenotypes through time, again, based on this internal and external changes that an individual experiences. So here we have a notion that what balance entails, of course, is going to be something specific to this space of capacities of an individual, so this homeodynamic space, and how this shifts through time. And of course, when you bring in temporality, you bring in another set of insights that come from aging research, and particularly from life history theory, that with any change that we see within this homeodynamic and phenotypic space, there are unavoidable survival costs. And another way of saying this and spelling it out, of course, is that there are unavoidable trade-offs that organisms are faced with. We cannot establish in this sense a universally optimal phenotype that's optimal in any and all environments, but we have different trade-offs. In other words, you have certain increases in one area that comes at the expense or decrease in others. And this can kind of be spelled out in different ways. So we have examples, kind of more evolutionary trade-offs between processes involving growth and reproductive fitness, and then later somatic maintenance. There's physiological trade-offs between physical fitness and kind of general survival and longevity, and even down to kind of specific biomarkers like IGF-1 and the regulation of the p53 gene. So I think one insight from this is that while there may be no best aging phenotype, there does seem to be a kind of landscape of optima involved with respect to longevity. So in other words, there seem to be ways to track and to try to specify those trajectories where these buffering capacities that I mentioned on the previous slide are maintained with the smallest decrease in phenotypic possibilities. In other words, that come at the least cost to longevity. I think in this sense, then what balance entails in this context is really trying to optimize these sorts of trade-offs that we see within an organism. And so this then gets to the other question about what it is to be healthy. And I think this is a way of kind of categorizing this or characterizing this. And that this research provides certain ways in which we might assess organisms through time. And again, shifting from the notion of health as a state to kind of health as an overall trajectory, we think about how we might assess these trade-offs in regulating the dynamic equilibrium or controlling damage on various levels throughout the organism, generally maximizing our capacities at the lowest cost to longevity. And I think in a sense, when the sciences of healthy aging, what they're trying to do is precisely measure these kinds of changes. And so what I've been working on recently is to try to develop or suggest there may be a kind of theory at work here in terms of conceiving of health as a landscape of these optimized phenotypic trajectories. And we might spell this out a little bit, at least quickly, and just say that we could measure this notion of health in terms of the difference between what an individual was able to do and what it now can, and the costs involved in maintaining this trajectory. And this is kind of borne out in a few studies, one looking at the kind of a longitudinal molecular profiling of so-called ageotypes, looking at how we can track specific kind of molecular signatures within individuals and how these do pan onto or kind of map onto the ability to maintain certain capacities through time. And this is also been done looking at the notion of intrinsic capacities and being able to measure specific biomarkers generally associated with longevity, things like walking speed and grip strength. And so I think what kind of the aim could be coming out of this notion would be to try to establish what these sort of health optima or peaks can be in terms of trying to find those instances where we might have the most stability in terms of this sort of capacity through time, or even an increase in one's capacities that come with the fewest costs. I think, again, kind of using a sort of graphic like this, it certainly leads to the notion that there would be many ways to achieve a healthy or optimized trajectory. So just wrapping this up then, there are, again, many physiological theories, kind of local explanations in a sense, but there doesn't seem to be anything to kind of tie all this together. And at least one methodological approach to this could be to look at whether or not the references of the health sciences do portray any kind of unity and can provide some kind of a framework into asking new questions. And at least going through these two sciences here of immunology and biogerontology, it suggests some way to think about what it is that's healthy, this sort of globally regulated multi-organismal unit, and how the health of this unit can be determined or can be understood in terms of this optimized phenotypic trade-offs. Now, of course, there's still much more work, I think, that needs to be done in terms of trying to see how such a theory like this could be carried out, how it could be falsified, how we might assess its explanatory power, and certainly other candidates are going to be needed, coming from or bringing insights from many other sciences. And it's also likely the case that it's at least partly wrong, if not entirely wrong, but at least it's a suggestion. And with each error that comes through, we may better know a little bit more about what it takes to be right and how we might actually develop a theory of health, the health sciences. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
Thanks a lot. And we still have a dozen minutes roughly for discussion. So the floor is open to questions, critical comments. Martin, you again the first to raise your hand.
Can you actually, since you are sharing the screen with us, can you go back 2 slides?
Sure. Let's see.
Basically, I want to ask a question regarding the measurement, measuring the health. Yeah. So if I wonder. Right. Yeah. Thanks. I wonder to what extent this could be construed as a sort of a, rather than a general theory, as a individual oriented theory, or a theory that's applicable to individuals rather than something that would apply across individuals. And the reason why I'm asking is that if it's measured in terms of the difference between, as you say, what an individual was able to do and what it can, what it now can. So then, can you actually compare basically the health among different individuals, and how would you do that?
Well, yeah, it's a really good question, Martin. I think, I mean, part of the idea, at least initially, was to be able to see how, or I mean, at least one of the implications can be that it's important to be able to see how health could at least be measured on an individual level. And of course, if you're going to have a theory of health, it does need to be something that can be specific to individuals in this sense, and not necessarily just a kind of general suggestion or a generalized set of norms in this sense. But I think nonetheless, if the idea is that you can, the basic idea with trying to see how what is at stake in health, again, is in terms of trying to maximize capacities or kind of maintain this sort of trajectory at least cost. This general principle seems to be something that would pertain or would hold across individuals. And so I think part of the idea, at least initially, and maybe building on some of these studies in a way, is to look at whether or not we already see on an individual level this kind of pattern in trajectories, and then how you could kind of build from this sort of individual observations in a sense to see, I mean, again, whether there may be a broader pattern or a broader implications of this for some kind of more general principle. But I think in a certain sense, I'm not sure if this was kind of what you were getting at in a way, but I think the fact that it may be something more specific to an individual seems to be more of a strength in a way than a weakness to what the theory might suggest.
So, yeah, so I'm generally on board. I think it's a good suggestion. The question was really just about, so for instance, if you have a birth defect that's considered, you know, unhealthy. So for instance, phenylketonuria, I'm probably pronouncing it incorrectly.
Yeah.
Phenylketon. Well, anyway, so the, you know, the problem with metabolizing phenylalanine. So if you have that, for instance, then you're considered unhealthy, I guess. So you need to be on a strict diet right from the birth or from the time that it's diagnosed. And so as an individual, you know, you can be considered healthy irrespectively of this defect, because there is no sort of change in time, right? So but when you actually have the reference class is the general population, then clearly you have a problem, right? So you're not healthy in this at least intuitive sense. So that's, I mean, if I'm making myself clear, I'm not sure, but that was what I was after.
Yeah, and it's a good point. And I think, I mean, maybe another way of saying this, I guess, and going back to this notion of thinking about, you know, health in terms of this kind of a landscape of different optima, in the sense, I mean, there certainly should be many ways to be able to think about what a health can be, or kind of what a healthy phenotype could be, or what a healthy trajectory in this space could entail. And I think it at least allows for the possibility to say, well, all right, we can see how relative to this individual's you know, physiological makeup, genetic makeup, in the sense that he or she would have a different kind of set of, you know, possibilities before them, so that the trajectory that they could be on would be quite different than someone else who is without that same you know, genetic constitution, in a sense. But so we could describe, in this sense, different possibilities that would be available to that individual. And I think in a broader sense, we could still develop a kind of an ability to compare, to be able to say, well, you may be healthier in that sense without it, at least in the general sense that you would have, you know, more capacities in terms of your kind of having this enzyme to be able to break down phenylalanine, for example. But that doesn't necessarily in itself render that individual unhealthy, again, relative to what kind of possibilities are available for, or what capacities are available for that individual. Does that help make sense a little bit?
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. So for more questions, please use the raise hand feature, which you can find under the participants tab. Since I don't see any raised hands at the moment, maybe I can jump in. I'm thinking about the measuring component as well, when we compare your suggested attempt to give this kind of measure for health versus the problem of how do we measure aging, where it's customary that people speak of like aging at different speeds, probably where they have deviated from the unit as the physiological organism as a unit. Would it be possible also to go to lower levels and apply your framework or a similar method for measuring the health of different organs or cells, to say like my liver is much healthier than my eyes, for example, which could be a meaningful statement in some context, and people would maybe want to express that and spell it out with a explication in your case as well. That would be useful. You have any thoughts on this lower level measures?
Yeah, so thanks. It's also a really good question. I mean, I don't have I guess a clear or a fixed answer on this in a certain sense, but I would think that part of or one way of approaching it at least would be to suggest I do think it makes sense to refer to parts in this way as being healthier or not in this sense. But I mean, if we're trying to say what we're after in a certain sense, of course, is the organism, is an individual healthy? And so I think at some point, in a certain sense, you're still going to have to be able to relate the sort of the functional capacities in the sense of a given part to, you know, the overall survival, or you're going to have to relate it to something in a sense. And I think relating it to the general survival, the longevity of the overall organism, I think is still going to be something that's necessary to kind of make sense of health. I think to at least maintain some kind of intuitive understanding of what health is. It should be tied to that sort of the overall longevity of an organism. So I think, you can still make sense of these different changes within on the level of parts, but I think there's something about the whole that still seems to be important for understanding and for making a kind of medical decision. So
good response. Yes, definitely. Makes a lot of sense.
Okay, thanks.
So are there any other questions?
Stop sharing.
I don't see any raised hands at the moment. And we are just 2 minutes away from our lunch break. So unless there is one very last minute idea popping into someone's head, I would suggest that we thank our speaker, Jonathan, and also our previous speaker of the session, Tonya, again.
Thank you very much.
Also for the discussion. And now it's time for the lunch break, and I think we continue at 2:30 with the next session.